Frederick and Catherine have now spent their last evening together in a hotel in Milano, eating a sumptuous meal, drinking wine, and trying to make plans to stay in touch with each other as the young lieutenant is about to board the train that will take him back to his former comrades and whatever else awaits him in Gorizia. My name is Trisha Slapizzi. I'm your host for Tea and Bedtime Stories. In this episode, I'll continue reading Ernest Hemingway's novel, A Farewell to Arms. Last time we finished chapter 23 of book 2, and now I will continue the story with chapter 24 to end book 2. After the reading, I'll follow up with a few quick facts and my impressions. So let's begin chapter 24. We walked down the stairs instead of taking the elevator. The carpet on the stairs was worn. I had paid for the dinner when it came up, and the waiter who had brought it was sitting on a chair near the door. He jumped up and bowed, and I went with him into the side room and paid the bill for the room. The manager had remembered me as a friend and refused payment in advance, but when he retired and had remembered to have the waiter stationed at the door so that I should not get out without paying. I suppose that had happened even with his friends. One had so many friends in a war. I asked the waiter to get us a carriage, and he took Catherine's package that I was carrying and went out with an umbrella. Outside through the window, we saw him crossing the street in the rain. We stood in the side room and looked out the window. How do you feel, Cat? Sleepy. I feel hollow and hungry. Have you anything to eat? Yes, in my musette. I saw the carriage coming. I stopped, the horse's head hanging in the rain, and the waiter stepped out, opened his umbrella, and came toward the hotel. We met him at the door and walked out under the umbrella down the wet walk to the carriage at the curb. Water was running in the gutter. There's your package on the seat, the waiter said. He stood with the umbrella until we were in, and I had tipped him. Many thanks, pleasant journey, he said. The coachman lifted the reins, and the horse started. The waiter turned away under the umbrella and went toward the hotel. We drove down the street and turned to the left and then came around to the right in front of the station. There were 2 carabinieri standing under the light just out of the rain. The light shone on their hats. The rain was clear and transparent against the light of the station. A porter came out from under the shelter of the station, his shoulders up against the rain. No, I said, thanks, I don't need thee. He went back under the shelter of the archway. I turned to Catherine. Her face was in the shadow from the hood of the carriage. We might as well say goodbye. I can't go in? No. Goodbye, Cat. Well, you tell him at the hospital? Yes. I told the driver the address to drive to. He nodded. Goodbye, I said. Take care of yourself and young Catherine. Goodbye, darling. Goodbye, I said. I stepped out into the rain and the carriage started. Catherine leaned out and I saw her face in the light. She smiled and waved. The carriage went up the street. Catherine pointed in toward the archway. I looked. There were only 2 carabinieri in the archway. I realized she meant for me to get in out of the rain. I went in and stood and watched the carriage turn the corner. Then I started through the station and down the runway to the train. The porter was on the platform looking for me. I followed him into the train, crowding past people and along the aisles and through a door to where the machine gunner sat in the corner of a full compartment. My rucksack and musettes were above his head on the luggage rack. There were many men standing in the corridor, and the men in the compartment all looked at us when we came in. There were not enough places in the train, and everyone was hostile. The machine gunner stood up for me to sit down. Someone tapped me on the shoulder. I looked around. It was a very tall, gaunt captain of artillery with a red scar along his jaw. He had looked through the glass on the corridor and then came in. "What do you say?" I asked. I had turned and faced him. He was taller than I, and his face was very thin, under the shadow of his cap visor, and the scar was new and shiny. Everyone in the compartment was looking at me. "You can't do that," he said. "You can't have a soldier save you a place." "I have done it." He swallowed, and I saw Adam's apple go up and then down. The machine gunner stood in front of the place. Other men looked in through the glass. No one in the compartment said anything. "You have no right to do that. I was here 2 hours before you came." "What do you want?" "The seat." "So do I." I watched his face and could feel the whole compartment against me. I did not blame him. He was in the right, but I wanted the seat. Still no one said anything. Oh, hell, I thought. "Sit down, Signor Capitano," I said. The machine gunner moved out of the way, and the tall captain sat down and he looked at me. His face seemed hurt, but he had the seat. "Get my things," I said to the machine gunner. We went out in the corridor. The train was full, and I knew there was no chance of a place. I gave the porter and the machine gunner 10 lire apiece. They went down the corridor and outside on the platform, looking in the windows, but there were no places. "Maybe some will get off at Gorizia," the porter said. "More will get on at Gorizia," I said the machine gunner. I said goodbye to them, and we shook hands and they left. They both felt badly. Inside the train, we were all standing in the corridor when the train started. I watched the lights of the station and the yards as we went out. It was still raining, and soon the windows were wet and you could not see out. Later, I slept on the floor of the corridor, first putting my pocketbook with my money and papers in it inside my shirt and trousers, so that it was inside the leg of my breeches. I slept all night, waking at Gorizia and Verona when more men got on the train, but going back to sleep at once. I had my head on one of the musettes and my arm around the other, and I could feel the pack. And they could walk all over me if they wouldn't step on me. Men were sleeping on the floor all down the corridor. Others stood holding on to the window rods and leaning against the door. That train was always crowded. And that's the end of chapter 24 and the end of book 2. So, a few quick facts. The Carabinieri, if you remember, refers to the members of the Italian paramilitary police. Gorizia is a town just straight west of Milano, and it's like the first major city, I guess, on the way to the west coast. There's a road that goes straight to Venice from Milano, and it's the first town. When he talks about breeches, I had to look that up because I guess it's a British word that we acquired in the United States. We call them breeches, or at least that's what the only ever term I've ever heard, but I guess it originally referred to same thing, pants. Mostly, I guess, they end below the knee. It's what they called breeches. I don't know. That specific use of the word survived into the 20th century when people started calling them knee breeches. I always heard them called, those kind of pants called knickers. But people stopped wearing them by the 70s, I think, when I came into the world. And they were only worn by young boys. Like, once you were a full-grown man, you wore trousers or long breeches. That's what they call them in the South. But I always thought of breeches as like long johns or underwear or something you wear under your clothes, not like a formal pant. So it's weird that he was wearing breeches or breeches. Verona is another town farther west of Gorizia, and it's about at the halfway point between Milano and Venice. So this is a short chapter, so those are only quick facts that I have. My impressions: this chapter is really uneventful, to say the least, but I suppose it was necessary to mark the end of his time in Milano. It is curious that Fred knew exactly which hotel would take an unmarried couple, and that the manager considered him a friend, albeit not a true friend. But how and why do they know each other? Has he stayed there before with other women? I don't get how this dude gets around so much. But I think it's kind of obvious that Hemingway is embellishing the narrative based on his own experiences after the war. And the timeline just never adds up entirely. But I also don't get how gullible audiences were at the time. Then again, they didn't have access to all the information we probably take for granted. Or perhaps they were just accustomed to the use of hyperbole and learned not to scrutinize anything too closely, which I will admit I have a bad habit of doing. I am very critical. I can't help myself. But I think it's kind of messed up that the Capitano pulled rank and took the seat he paid to reserve. I mean, he was probably mad that he couldn't afford to bribe someone, or he didn't think of it himself. And I do kind of hate that money buys so much privilege, but what can one do? It does beg the question, how on earth can he afford this lifestyle? I mean, he does not make good money, we know that. And he only gets a certain amount of support from relatives, we know that. And yet he hardly ever runs out of money. I've never seen anyone who doesn't have a high-paying job live like that. I mean, there are trust fund babies in Scottsdale, Arizona, that pretend to live like that, but they don't really live like that. We call them $30,000 millionaires because they have no money, but they all drive Lamborghinis and, I don't know, act stupid. But I get that it's a work of fiction, but I think it still should be believable, and I don't see how this is very believable. But not for me to say, I guess. I'm just one person. What do I know? The narrator of the story is a freeloader, but exactly who he is sponging off of is very unclear. To me, at least. If you have more information, I'd love to hear your thoughts. We know Ernest himself was accused of being a freeloader to an extent. Some critics speculate that he began having an affair with his second wife when he was living in Paris, when he was still married to his first wife, because of her money and her connections. He appears to have been supported by her and her family while he was establishing himself as a young author. In fact, this book is dedicated to G.A. Pfeiffer, who apparently was his second wife Pauline's Uncle Gus, and a benefactor of the Hemingways. Mr. Pfeiffer, from my understanding, was the one who purchased their house in Key West, and he was the one who apparently gifted them a trip to Africa for a safari that he'd always wanted to go on, and that trip inspired a later book that Hemingway wrote called The Green Hills of Africa. But the contrast between the lush setting of the hotel in Milano and Lieutenant Henry's sleeping on a floor is pretty vivid. He does go from hero to zero in a matter of hours. And it shows that the abrupt and disruptive nature of war is forefront at this point in the story. And it kills our sense of certainty and stability instantly when things like that happen, when wars break out or whatever. I mean, I've personally never lived through a war in my own land, but I am acutely aware of the disruptions that violence brings into our lives. Just from my early childhood, it's why I moved around so much. When I was a kid, things happen and destructive power make impulsive decisions, and it ruins other people's happiness in an instant. I won't go into more detail unless you're curious, but I can empathize with Henry's current feelings, even if the character who's going through it is trying his best to ignore or deflect his own feelings. Anyway, that's all I have for chapter 24, book 2. And again, that ends book 2. So in the next episode, we'll begin book 3 of A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway by reading chapter 25. So please join me for more teen bedtime stories. I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks for listening.